Hi everybody, this is Bastiaan and this is the follow-up of a game I played a while back using the Lion's Claw. This time against a stronger opponent called EnginMax, which is about 2300 elo. So it's best that you first watch the 3 videos I made on that and we can pick up on that point. So I'm starting the game out with this position, which is the Lion's Claw. But instead of the bishop to b5 move played in the earlier game, white is going to play g3, the king size fianchetto. So how do we continue after this? And we've seen in the previous video that the moves that I prefer are c6, d5, queen to c7, and h6, and we're going to see all the same moves played in this game as well. So it is white to move, excuse me, black to move. The first move we play is the c6 move, and this seems to already blunt the diagonal for the bishop, but the c6 is mostly used to prepare for the b5 pawn break, and black shouldn't worry too much about the bishop on g2, simply because there's a pawn on e4 blocking that diagonal. And even if d5 is played and I capture, if white were to recapture, there is still a pawn on the diagonal. So it's not quite easy for white to take advantage of the bishop on g2. So c6, just the same. Bishop to g2. b5. We have a weak pawn on c6, but it is not easy to attack with the bishop. White castles, and now black may play the c7 move, which supports the pawns on d6 and c6, but I'm not going to do that yet, and instead I play the aggressive a5. White continues with rook to e1, and I play bishop to a6, targeting the f1 square with the discovered attack on the knight. So the rook to e1 move was going to be played anyways. White takes out the pawn on e5, pawn recaptures, bishop to g5, aggressive developments, trying to take out the rook on f6. I continue with bishop to c5, developing my own bishop. We note that we have plenty of space to fall back, and we note that we have 2 adjacent diagonals with our 2 bishops developed. So that seems like the perfect spot. Bishop to h3, also creating an attack with adjacent diagonals. And the bishop to h3 move presents black with a problem, because if the bishop takes out this knight, there's no longer any protection on the pawn being attacked by the knight on f3. So normally we could recapture with this knight, but this knight also is in danger of being taken out. So we follow the book move, queen to c7, and this move protects the knight on d7, the pawn, the backwards pawn on c6, the unprotected pawn on a5, but it also protects our pawn on c5 against the attack of the knight. White plays knight to d2, so he's not willing to exchange pieces yet. I play h6, the final move in the system, which almost always is played, forcing White to give up his adjacent diagonals of his two bishops. Now White may choose to take on the bishop, or the knight, or the other knight, or retreat and abandon the bishop diagonals. So he plays bishop to e3, and we'll see why in a second. Now he's attacking my bishop, but I'm keeping it simple. I take out his bishop. Now White recaptures with the rook. I castle, and White finally takes out my knight on d7. I recapture with my knight. And the point of doing so is that black is now left with not a bishop pair but only one bishop, and White has gotten rid of both the bishops, so the two knights together are stronger than just one knight and one bishop. However, black is having a superior position because of the aggressive pawn storming, and it's not clear what these two knights are going to do, because there is no more room for them to develop to. Perhaps knight to b3, but that will be met with either a3 or simply a4 or b4, attacking those knights. So the knights are a little bit stuck already. Game continues with queen to f3, and it's difficult for White to find a winning move here. I continue development with rook to d8, rook to the open file. White does the same, and now black has two attacking ideas. Either he can simply start pushing the b pawn to attack the knight, or he can start remaneuvering the knight to d5, with the ultimate goal, remaneuvering to e6 and then d4, with the nice outpost protected by the e-pawn, where he's coincidentally already forking queen and a pawn. So b4 immediately is fine, but it still leaves an escape square for the knight on a4. So I'm keeping both options open, and I play knight to c5. This prevents the escape to a4 of the knight, and also later on I may remaneuver to the d4 square. So both options are still attacking ideas for black. Game continues with rook e3 to e1. So again, it's difficult for White to find a move here. I play b4. Now the knight is forced to retreat to c1, excuse me, b1. And what black may try now is knight to a4, attacking the pawn on b2. But I don't like the idea, because the queen can step in with queen to b3, protecting the pawn and attacking the knight. And it's difficult for this knight to be protected. After bishop to b5, White may continue with c4, and it's too much trouble. So we're going to have to wait in order to play that move. Instead I play rook to d4. So what I'm trying to do now is set up an Alekhine's gun with the rook, queen and the rook on the same file, taking control of the open d file. White plays queen to e3. I continue with queen to d6, which is the best move, protecting all pieces. So we see that the knight is protected even if the rook has to flee. White plays queen to f3, finding it difficult to find a good move. Finally, rook to d8, so we have an Alekhine's gun on the board. And this Alekhine's gun is not strong enough to crush through, because if rook takes knight, simply knight recaptures. However, it is strong enough to keep the knight in his place. Because if, for instance, knight goes to b3, attacking rook and knight, so this has to be responded to, I can crush through, rook takes rook, then if, for instance, knight recaptures, we get rook takes rook check, king to g2, bishop to f1 is the checkmate, so that cannot be played. And alternatively, if instead of knight takes knight, we get rook takes rook, queen recaptures, rook takes takes on d1 check with a fork. King flees, and first knight takes knight, because this knight has no escape squares. And we can see that white has lost all pieces. So let's go back. We can see that this knight is now stuck because of the Alekhine's gun. So white has to find something else. And he plays instead c3, attacking the rook. But that square is protected by our overextended pawn on b4. So we could recapture the pawn on c3, after which it will be recaptured again with the same threat, and the same result will happen. So I'm not going to recapture. So let's see what would happen. Pawn takes pawn, pawn recaptures, rook to d3, and we can see queen to e2 perhaps. Then rook takes pawn on g3, check with the discovered attack on the queen. So that's all very nice. So let's go back. If instead the queen flees to g4, I can play bishop to c8, attacking the queen. Queen retreats, and now bishop to e6, attacking the pawn on a2. If say a3, now black has a choice. Either bishop to a2, attacking the knight, which weakens this knight, which is threatened by the Alekhine's gun. Or alternatively, we could play bishop to b3, directly attacking the rook on d1, so that's also possible. If it's taken out, rook takes rook, rook recaptures, queen takes rook, queen recaptures, and rook takes queen on d1, again with the fork, and all pieces will be lost, same way. The knight will be stuck on the b1 square. So now let's go back. So we could take on the pawn, however this wasn't played. What else is possible? If we grab the knight at this point, black will be losing simply because of knight recaptures, so not possible. So we can recapture the pawn, or immediately, and this was played, rook to d3, attacking the queen. Rook blocks, rook takes, queen recaptures, and now we see that the queen is no longer available to move to b3 and protect the b2 pawn. So the next move will obviously be knight to a4, attacking the pawn. and there's no defense against this. So the queen can no longer move in to protect to b3 to protect the pawn. If b3, say, is played to protect the pawn and kick away the knight, black can play knight takes pawn, getting the free pawn that way, forking rook and knight. And if knight recaptures, pawn recaptures, and we can see that white will be lost under the threat of what's left of the Alekhine's gun. So b3 isn't played. Instead white plays rook to c1, because white will lose tempo after grabbing the pawn on b2. So I grab the pawn anyways. White continues with, if say a random move is played, I could continue with c5, and we can take advantage of the 3 against 1 pawn advantage we have. Alternatively, if not a random move is played, but pawn takes pawn, we can simply recapture. And after a random move, rook to c8, and we can continue our pawn push with this passed pawn center. But if queen to b6 is played, which was played, we see an attack on the bishop, the pawn, and a discovered attack on the knight, discovered attack perhaps on the pawn, after these two pawns get exchanged. So we are seeing a counterplay from white. But I simply grab the pawn, creating an attack on the knight on d2, sacrificing this bishop if needed. If queen takes bishop, pawn takes knight, and we have a threat of grabbing the rook or promoting to a queen. So if knight takes, queen takes, attacking the rook, rook to f1 to protect. We can see that white has a lost game at this point, being down a pawn and a knight. So grabbing the bishop will be losing. So let's go back. Instead of grabbing the bishop, white takes out the pawn on c3. And walks into the fork with knight to a4, forking queen and rook. Now white has a choice to grab either a minor piece or a pawn and a minor piece, so he goes for the pawn and a minor piece. Queen takes pawn. Knight takes rook. Queen takes knight, so he's gaining a pawn and a minor piece. Now bishop to d3, trying to get rid of this knight on b1. White grabs another free pawn on a5. I grab the knight, white recaptures. So I'm down a pawn, but I'm up a rook in the exchange. But queen to d1 check, king flees, and we have an attack on the knight on b1, but we cannot take the knight yet because there's also an attack on the rook on d8, so we have to move it out of the way. Rook to d3, Now queen takes knight is possible also. We can come in with a check on e3. Queen takes pawn. I go for the check. King flees. I grab one pawn, attacking his second one. Queen to a5, hoping to trade queens. Good move would be rook to f3 to stop that. But I'm just grabbing the pawn. Queen to c8 check. King flees. Queen to a5 check. g6. And we can see now that queen takes pawn is not possible, because at a2 you're protecting the f7 pawn. Queen to f6 instead. Now queen takes knight at this point is a mistake, because this allows a draw for white after taking the pawn by threefold repetition. So we are not going to take on the knight. We have to keep protecting the f7 pawn. So I play h5 instead, creating some more breathing room for the king. Knight goes to c3. It cannot be recaptured, of course, because it is protected by the queen. Queen to c4. Now we are threatening the capture of the rook, of the knight. Knight to d5, and this is now blocking the defense of the pawn on f7. So we have to be very aggressive now in our play. So we're going to throw in a few checks. Queen c8 check, rook d2 check, queen g4 check, rook e3 check, rook takes pawn check, queen to c8 check, a queen to d7. There are no longer checks available, but we are back at the square to protect f7. And now we have pinned the knight with the discovered check on the king on d2. Queen to g5 in order to protect the knight. But now rook to d4 check, and the knight will be crushed between the rook and the queen. King flees. I grab the knight, opting for the queen. Queens get exchanged, and you're nearing the end of the game with black one rook and one pawn up. So after the following few moves, the engine decided to resign. So I hope you enjoyed watching this annotation, which is an update of the Lion's Claw, but against the King's Indian. Please like, subscribe and leave a comment.